She had built an empire from nothing. 40 years of 18-hour days, boardroom battles, and iron-willed decisions had turned Eleanor Whitmore into one of the most powerful women in American business. She owned 3 companies, 2 penthouse apartments, and a 12-room Georgian mansion in Connecticut that she had paid for entirely with her own money. Her name was on the buildings, her signature was on the checks, and her husband, Richard, had never worked a single day in their 31-year marriage. But Eleanor didn't mind, or at least that's what she told herself. She loved him. She had always loved him, even when the love started to feel more like habit than fire. Even when the dinners got quieter and the conversations got shorter, and Richard started spending more evenings at the club than at home. Eleanor was a businesswoman. She understood investments, she understood loss, and she understood, better than most, that some things depreciate over time. What she did not understand, what she had never once prepared herself for, was betrayal. Not like this. It was a Thursday evening in late October, when Eleanor's entire world cracked open like a fault line beneath her feet. She had just wrapped up a 14-hour acquisition meeting in Manhattan, and decided on a rare whim to stop at Maison Dorée, the intimate French restaurant on the Upper East Side that she and Richard had once called their place. She hadn't been there in years. Richard never wanted to go anymore, said it felt too formal, too stuffy. She pushed open the heavy oak door, still wearing her charcoal Armani blazer, her silver hair pinned into that signature chignon that made every junior executive in her office straighten their spine. The maitre d' recognized her immediately and moved to greet her. But Eleanor had already stopped walking. Because there, tucked into the corner booth, the very booth where Richard had proposed to her 34 years ago, sat her husband of 3 decades. And he was not alone. Across from him was a woman, young, extraordinarily beautiful, dark hair cascading past her shoulders, red lips, and a laugh so effortless it could have been bottled and sold. She was leaning forward, her fingers resting lightly on Richard's wrist, saying something in a low voice that made him smile in a way Eleanor hadn't seen in years. The kind of smile he used to save for her. Eleanor did not gasp, she did not cry, she did not reach for her phone or turn around and walk out. She stood perfectly still, the way she always did when the numbers on a balance sheet didn't add up, and she needed a moment to let reality settle before she responded. She watched for exactly 4 seconds. Then she walked toward the table. Richard saw her when she was 3 steps away. The color drained from his face so completely it was almost medically fascinating. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. The young woman, sensing the shift in energy, turned her head and looked up at Eleanor with wide, curious eyes. There was a pause, the kind of pause that compresses time. And then Richard did something that Eleanor would replay in her mind for the rest of her life. Not with pain, but with a cold, crystalline clarity that would fuel everything that came next. He leaned toward the young woman, and in smooth, confident French, he said, "Ne t'inquiète pas, ma chérie, c'est juste ma femme de ménage. She's just my maid." He said it with a little smile, a dismissive flick of the wrist, the casual cruelty of a man who believed, completely and without question, that the woman standing 3 feet away from him had no idea what he had just said. After all, Richard had always assumed Eleanor's world was spreadsheets and shareholder meetings, not languages and literature. He had never paid enough attention to know the difference. The young woman, whose name Eleanor would later learn was Camille, let out a soft, relieved laugh and reached for her wine glass. And Eleanor Whitmore, founder and CEO of Whitmore Capital Group, fluent in English, Mandarin, and French since the age of 22, slowly pulled out the empty chair at the end of the table and sat down. Both of them stared at her. She picked up the menu, opened it, studied it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she set it down, folded her hands on the white linen tablecloth, and looked directly at Camille, not Richard, but Camille, and said in flawless, unaccented Parisian French, "Ma chérie, je ne suis pas la femme de ménage, je suis la femme. Et cette table, ce restaurant, et l'homme assis en face de toi, je les possède tous les trois. Darling, I am not the maid. I am the wife. And this table, this restaurant, and the man sitting across from you, I own all three." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eleanor had ever heard. Camille's wineglass stopped halfway to her lips. Richard's face, somehow, went even whiter. The couple at the next table pretended not to notice, while clearly noticing everything. Eleanor stood, smoothed her blazer, and before she turned to leave, she looked at Richard, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years, and said quietly, in English, so there would be no misunderstanding, "Don't come home tonight, or any night after that." She walked out of Maison Dorée the same way she had walked into every boardroom, every courtroom, every room that had ever tried to make her feel small, like she owned it, because she did. Eleanor didn't cry in the car, she didn't cry in the elevator, she didn't cry when she walked into the mansion, set her briefcase down on the marble entryway table, and stood in the hallway of the home she had built with her own hands and her own money for 31 years. She looked around at the vaulted ceilings, the original oil paintings, the grand staircase that curved upward like a question mark, and she felt something move through her chest that wasn't grief. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that only arrives after the very last illusion has been shattered. She walked to her study, the one room in the house that was entirely hers, the one room Richard had never bothered to redecorate or claim or even fully enter, and she sat down at her desk. She did not pour a drink. She did not call a friend. She opened her laptop, and she began to work. Because Eleanor Whitmore had learned something a long time ago, in the earliest and hardest years of building her business from a one-room office with a second-hand desk and a phone that rang maybe twice a day. She had learned that when the world knocks you down, the most dangerous thing you can do is stay on the floor. Not once in her life. By midnight, she had already made 3 calls. The first was to Marcus Webb, her personal attorney, a sharp and quietly formidable man who had been by her side through every major legal battle of her career. He picked up on the second ring because he always picked up on the second ring, no matter the hour, because that was the kind of loyalty that Eleanor Whitmore inspired in the people who truly knew her. She told him what had happened in the restaurant. She told him calmly, concisely, the way she delivered bad news in board meetings. Facts first, emotion later, action always. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a brief pause, and then he said simply, "I'll have the paperwork started by morning." The second call was to her financial director, a meticulous woman named Patricia Osei, who managed the architecture of Eleanor's personal accounts with the same precision she brought to everything else. Eleanor told Patricia to freeze every joint credit card, every shared account, every line of credit that carried Richard's name alongside hers. Patricia asked no questions. She had worked for Eleanor for 16 years. She understood that when Eleanor called at midnight with instructions, the instructions were not suggestions. The third call was the one that surprised even Eleanor herself. She called her daughter. Vivian Whitmore was 34 years old, lived in Chicago, and had spent most of her adult life navigating the complicated emotional geography of having Eleanor as a mother. They loved each other fiercely and clumsily, the way women do when they are too similar to be comfortable and too connected to be distant. Vivian answered on the 4th ring, her voice thick with sleep, and then sharpening immediately when she heard her mother's tone. "Mom, what happened?" Eleanor told her, all of it. The restaurant, the corner booth, the French. The smile on Richard's face when he thought he was safe. When she finished, the line was quiet for a long moment, and then Vivian said something that Eleanor would carry with her like a small, warm stone in her pocket for months afterward. "Mom, you have always been the most powerful person in every room you've ever walked into. Tonight was no different. He just finally showed you who he actually is, and you already know exactly what to do." Eleanor hung up, and for the first time all evening, she closed her eyes. She did not sleep. By 6 the next morning, she was dressed. By 7, she had reviewed the preliminary divorce documentation that Marcus had emailed overnight. By 8, she was sitting across from him in his midtown office, signing the first set of papers, with the same steady hand she used to sign acquisition deals worth 9 figures. Marcus walked her through everything, methodically. Asset division, property rights, the prenuptial agreement that Eleanor, in a moment of clear-headed practicality 31 years ago, had insisted upon, and that Richard had signed with barely a glance. He had assumed back then that it would never matter, that she would never use it. He had assumed wrong. The prenuptial agreement was, by any legal standard, airtight. Eleanor had written it herself with Marcus's help, long before Richard had any sense of how serious her ambitions were, long before the companies existed and the mansion was built, and the name Whitmore meant something in every major financial capital in the world. The agreement stipulated clearly that all assets acquired before and during the marriage, under Eleanor's sole income, remained exclusively hers. The mansion in Connecticut, the apartment in Manhattan, the shares, the art, the accounts. Richard had contributed nothing financially to their life together, a fact that had never bothered Eleanor during the marriage because she loved him, and love, she believed, did not keep score. But love, she was now understanding, was not the same as vulnerability. And the document sitting on Marcus's desk proved that whatever Richard thought he was walking away with, he was wrong. He was walking away with his clothes, his car, which was leased in his name, and whatever dignity he could salvage from a situation he had engineered entirely by himself. Marcus slid a final paper across the desk. Eleanor signed it without hesitation. "One more thing," she said, capping her pen. "The mansion. I want him out by the weekend." Marcus nodded. "I'll have the formal notice delivered this afternoon." Eleanor stood, smoothed her jacket, and looked out the window, at the Manhattan skyline, the city that had shaped her, tested her, and ultimately crowned her. She had arrived here at 23 with a business degree, $100 in her bank account, and a certainty so deep it bordered on irrational that she was going to build something that mattered. She had done it. Through recessions and lawsuits and industry skeptics and 1,000 quiet moments of self-doubt that she had never let anyone see, she had done it entirely on her own. And she was not about to let one faithless man in a corner booth undo a single thread of it. She picked up her briefcase. "Send me the confirmation when it's delivered," she said, and she walked out. Richard Whitmore had always been a man who mistook comfort for security. He had lived inside Eleanor's world the way some people live inside a house they didn't build, enjoying the warmth, admiring the architecture, never once stopping to wonder what would happen if the door was locked from the outside. He had grown accustomed to the mansion's heated floors and the wine cellar stocked with bottles he hadn't paid for, and the black card that sat in his wallet like a permanent permission slip to exist without consequence. He had grown accustomed, most of all, to Eleanor, to her steadiness, to the quiet, unshakable way she held everything together while he moved through life like a man on a very long, very comfortable vacation. He arrived home the morning after the restaurant at just past 11, assuming, the way men like Richard always assume, that the situation was recoverable, that Eleanor would be upset, yes, that there would be a difficult conversation, certainly, but that ultimately, after the tears and the tension, things would settle back into their familiar pattern, because they always had, because Eleanor, for all her power in the boardroom, had always been, in Richard's private and deeply mistaken estimation, someone who needed him, someone who, beneath the blazer and the boardroom authority, was still the young woman who had once looked at him like he was everything. He turned his key in the front door of the mansion. It didn't turn. He tried again. Then again. He stepped back and looked at the door the way a man looks at something that has suddenly stopped making sense. Then he tried the side entrance. Then the garage code. Nothing worked. Every lock had been changed overnight with the kind of swift, silent efficiency that was Eleanor's most defining characteristic. She never made a decision and then waited. She decided and she moved, and by the time anyone else realized what was happening, the thing was already done. Richard called her cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He stood on the front steps of the Connecticut mansion. 12 rooms, Georgian architecture, 3 acres of manicured grounds, and understood, perhaps for the first time, that he was standing outside it rather than inside it. That the distinction, which had never mattered before, now meant everything. He called his personal card next, the one Eleanor had added him to 11 years ago, the one with the kind of limit that made hotel concierges smile. He had used it that very morning for a coffee and a parking garage on his way out of the city. He tried to use it now at a nearby gas station, because in the chaos of the previous evening, he had left the house without thinking about something as mundane as a full tank. The card was declined. He stared at the terminal, asked the attendant to try again. Declined again. He tried the backup card. Declined. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and counted what cash he had on him, $63, and felt something unfamiliar move through his chest. Not quite panic. Not yet. But the earliest, coldest edge of it. He called Marcus Webb's office by mistake, not realizing that Marcus was Eleanor's attorney, and not his. The receptionist told him politely that Mr. Webb was unavailable. Richard hung up and stood in the gas station parking lot in his Italian loafers and his cashmere coat, and stared at his phone like it had betrayed him personally. Then the notification arrived. It was a formal legal notice, delivered digitally and simultaneously by courier to every address Richard was associated with, and it was precise and thorough, and written in the clean, unambiguous language of someone who had spent decades making sure that every word she put on paper meant exactly what she intended it to mean. It informed Richard Whitmore that as per the terms of the prenuptial agreement signed on the 14th of March, 31 years prior, and in accordance with the formal divorce proceedings now initiated, he was required to vacate the property at 14 Aldermore Lane, Greenwich, Connecticut, within 72 hours. A personal effects coordinator would be available to assist him in retrieving his belongings under supervised conditions. All joint financial instruments had been suspended pending legal review. A formal divorce petition had been filed that morning in the state of Connecticut. Richard read it 3 times. Then he called Eleanor. She picked up on the 5th ring, not because she hadn't heard it sooner, but because she was finishing a sentence in a meeting with her senior leadership team. Because Eleanor Whitmore did not cancel meetings for personal crises, she scheduled personal crises around meetings, and she believed, correctly, that making Richard wait was the most honest thing she could do for both of them at that moment. Eleanor. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard before, stripped of its usual ease, something rawer underneath. Richard, she said. Her voice was the same as it always was, calm, even, unreadable to everyone except the people who knew her well enough to hear what was underneath the calm, which was not forgiveness, and was not fury, but was something far more final than either. It was conclusion. The tone of a woman who had already closed the chapter and was simply waiting for the last few words to catch up. Eleanor, this is extreme. Can we please just talk? Can we sit down and... We are talking, she said. You've changed every lock. You've frozen everything. I don't even have access to... I know, she said simply. BP. There was a pause, and then Richard, in the voice of a man reaching for something that is no longer there, said, I made a mistake. I know I did. But 31 years, Eleanor. 31 years has to count for something. And Eleanor was quiet for a moment, not because she was moved, but because she was, above everything else, a fair woman. And she wanted to give his words the consideration they deserved before she responded. You're right, she said finally. 31 years does count for something. It counts for the fact that I am giving you 72 hours instead of 24. It counts for the fact that I am not speaking to the press. It counts for the fact that I hired a coordinator to help you pack, instead of simply having your belongings placed outside the door. But Richard, you sat in the restaurant where you proposed to me, in our booth, and you called me the maid. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I'm going to go back to my meeting now, Eleanor said. The coordinator will be in touch. She hung up. Across the table from her, 6 of her most senior executives sat with the particular careful stillness of people who have just overheard something they know they will never forget. Eleanor set her phone face down on the table, looked up and said, Now. The 72 hours passed the way Eleanor had known they would. Quietly on her end, loudly on his. Richard made 7 more calls over the course of those 3 days, to Eleanor's cell, to the mansion's landline that she had already redirected, to Vivienne in Chicago, who listened to her father's voice for 40 seconds before saying, Dad, she knows French. She has always known French. This one is on you, and hanging up. He called mutual friends, 2 of whom called Eleanor afterward to let her know, and one of whom, she noted with neither surprise nor bitterness, did not call at all. He sent 3 text messages, each one longer and more elaborate than the last. the way apologies tend to expand when they are really arguments wearing apologies clothing. Eleanor read each one once, completely, because she was not a woman who looked away from things, and then she set her phone down and returned to whatever she had been doing before. She wanted to be honest with herself about that, because Eleanor Whitmore had built her life on honesty. The hard kind, the kind that doesn't soften itself for comfort. There were moments in those 72 hours, usually late at night, when the mansion was quiet in the way that large houses become quiet when they are no longer shared, where something moved through her that she could only describe as grief. Not for Richard as he was now, but for Richard as he had been, for the younger man who had once driven 4 hours in a snowstorm to bring her soup when she was sick during a business trip, for the early years, the lean years, when they had eaten cereal for dinner and laughed about it, and it had felt like enough. For the version of their life together that she had, somewhere along the way, stopped being able to find. She let herself feel it. One night, alone in the study, with a glass of red wine she barely touched, and the city quiet outside the window, she sat with the full weight of 31 years ending, and she did not push it away, or analyze it, or convert it into action. She simply felt it, the way you feel the last warmth of a fire that has already gone out. And then, when it had passed through her completely, she stood up, washed her face, and went to bed. She slept soundly for the first time in years. On the morning of the 73rd hour, the personal effects coordinator sent her a confirmation. Richard's belongings had been removed. The spare key had been returned. The mansion was entirely hers. Eleanor read the message over her morning coffee, standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the Connecticut grounds, where the October trees had gone full gold and amber, burning quietly in the early light, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Clean and uncomplicated and vast. She set down her coffee cup and called Vivienne. "It's done," she said. Vivienne exhaled. "How are you actually feeling, Mom?" Not the business answer, the real one. Eleanor considered this for a moment, with the same seriousness she gave every question worth answering. "Like someone opened a window in a room that had been closed for a very long time," she said. Vivienne was quiet for a beat. Then, "That might be the most human thing you've ever said to me." Eleanor laughed. It was small and genuine and surprised her slightly. "Don't get used to it," she said, but she was still smiling when she hung up. The divorce proceedings moved with the efficiency of a machine that had been perfectly designed for exactly this purpose. Because Marcus Webb was exactly that kind of attorney, and Eleanor had chosen him for exactly that reason. Richard retained his own counsel, a moderately capable man from a mid-tier firm who reviewed the prenuptial agreement, consulted 2 colleagues, and advised his client, as gently as the situation permitted, that the agreement was essentially unassailable and that his best path forward was a clean and uncontested settlement. Richard, to his credit, accepted this with more grace than Eleanor had expected. Perhaps the French incident had clarified something for him as well. Perhaps standing on the outside of the locked mansion had recalibrated his understanding of whose life he had actually been living inside. Whatever the reason, he signed. No courtroom, no drawn-out battle, no attempt to argue against the architecture of 31 years of Eleanor's meticulous financial self-sufficiency. He signed, and it was over. Eleanor received the finalized papers on a Wednesday afternoon in November, 4 weeks after the evening at Maison Dorée. She was in her Manhattan office when Marcus called. She was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the city she had conquered quietly and completely over 4 decades, the skyline glittering in the cold afternoon light, like something that had been built specifically to remind her of what persistence looked like at scale. "It's finalized," Marcus said. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, "for everything." She stood at the window for a long moment after she hung up. She thought about the girl she had been at 23, arriving in this city with $100 and an irrational certainty. She thought about all the rooms she had walked into, where people had underestimated her, because of her age, because of her gender, because of the particular and persistent human tendency to look at a woman and see less than what is actually there. She had never corrected them with words. She had always corrected them with outcomes. She thought about the corner booth at Maison Dorée, about the dismissive flick of Richard's wrist, about the word he had chosen, femme de ménage, and the casual confidence with which he had said it, so certain she wouldn't understand. She had spent 31 years building an empire, and in one careless sentence he had tried to reduce her to the woman who cleaned it. And she had answered him in his own language. That, she thought, was perhaps the most precise summary of her entire life. People had always tried to define her in their own terms, in the language of their own limitations, and Eleanor had always answered them in hers. She turned from the window. She had a 4 o'clock meeting, a new acquisition, a company in Boston that had been undervalued for 3 years by people who didn't know how to read what it was actually worth. Eleanor had known from the first day she looked at the numbers. She had been patient. She had waited. And now it was time to move. She picked up her briefcase, smoothed her jacket, walked to the door of her office, and paused with her hand on the frame, looking back once at the skyline through the window. That glittering, relentless city that had never once given her anything she hadn't earned. She smiled. Then Eleanor Whitmore, 61 years old, founder and CEO of Whitmore Capital Group, fluent in English, Mandarin, and French, owner of 3 companies, 2 penthouses, and one 12-room Georgian mansion in Connecticut, walked out of the room, like she owned it, because she did, and she always would. If Eleanor's story moved you, challenged you, or made you want to stand up and applaud a grandmother in a charcoal Armani blazer, leave a comment below and tell me where in the world you watched this from. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories about ordinary people who turn out to be anything but. Stories that remind you that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one everyone else chose to underestimate. Eleanor knew French. She had always known French. The only question was, when would she use it? Now you know the answer.